Take a look at this map of Europe just a few years after World War II. So this is late 1947, early 1948. All of the red countries in Eastern Europe are the countries which are already communist and already under Stalin's boot. Remember, you've got that weird example of Yugoslavia, who is communist, but from this point onwards will not have good relations with the Soviet Union because their leader, Marshal Tito, hated Stalin and Stalin hated him. The blue countries are capitalist and democratic, but there's no reason why they have to stay that way. Czechoslovakia, for example, just to the east of West Germany, had been overthrown by communists in 1948. Finally, we've got those yellow countries towards the southeast. They're Greece and Turkey. And at this point, they are specifically fighting communists within their own countries as well. Now, we've got a couple of options here of what Truman could do. You ever think about the pros and cons of each of these? So pause the video, maybe write down a few ideas in your notes. Now this lesson we're going to be looking at how Truman and America deepened the Cold War. Most of the examples of the Cold War increasing tensions that we've looked at so far, they seem to have been either Stalin or the East or the Soviet Union who are doing most things and then the West is reacting. This lesson we're going to look at the reverse, where America is trying to act in its interests and what it sees as the world interests, but as a result is deepening those Cold War tensions. Now, a couple of notes about this lesson. We are going to have another fill-in-the-blank sheet on Schoology, which I strongly recommend you use just because it means we'll be doing quite a lot less writing. If you're already sick of my voice, I'll be adding a few links in the description below the video, which you can look at to give you another idea of the sorts of things we're looking at. It's also the first lesson where we're going to be looking at some exam practice. And obviously, it's really important that you guys are doing as much exam practice as possible. The Cold War questions are unique. They don't repeat in your other exam papers like some of the others. So you've got to make sure you're practicing these in order to answer them as best as possible. So on your wonderful fill-in-the-blank sheet, there are two papers. Each paper has two columns in it. One side is going to be looking at America's actions. The other piece of paper is going to be looking at the Soviet Union's actions. So we'll look at America first, and then we'll go on to the Soviet Union. So thinking about the causes of the Truman Doctrine, or the Truman Plan, or the Truman Belief, or the Truman Idea. America feared that Stalin wanted to spread communism beyond Eastern Europe. These salami taxes had been working for a couple of years now. The Red Army was still either in Eastern Europe or were just moving out, having achieved their aims. America was worried that Stalin would not stop at Eastern Europe, which, to be honest, he probably wouldn't have. More specifically, the British forces in Greece and Turkey are struggling to fight back against the communists who are hoping to take over those countries. Britain had been majorly involved in here. As one of the great powers before World War II, they were finding that their economy and their military and their supplies were not stretching as far as they would like. So they were warning the Americans that without further help from America, the British would pull out. This would almost certainly result in Greece being overrun by communists and the Soviet Union exerting further control or more control over Turkey. More specifically, we've got Churchill's Iron Curtain speech that we looked at last lesson. He specifically gave that speech in America in order to sway US public opinion, and it was very, very successful for that. So looking at the event of the Truman Doctrine, President Truman gave a speech where he announced that the US would offer military help in the form of supplies or money or training or maybe even soldiers to help any country under the threat of communism. Now, our course focuses overwhelmingly on Europe, but that offer does go throughout the rest of the world as well. The Truman Doctrine is often described as the policy of containment. In other words, he promised to keep communism where it was. So he wasn't promising to roll back communism. In other words, he wasn't saying to a country like Czechoslovakia, which had just turned communist, we will invade your country to make it not communist. But he was promising countries like Greece or France or Portugal that if there are communists in your country and you don't want them there, we will help you. The result is very successful. Greece and Turkey do not turn communist. The British Army is given the supplies and the equipment it needs to continue the fight with the Greek government. They are a royalist government at this point. In other words, they have a monarchy, much like Britain did. Obviously, Stalin viewed this as a threat and as an insult. Why wouldn't he? Truman was publicly challenging Stalin's attempts to increase his control over places like Greece and Turkey. More importantly, every US president after Truman follows this policy of containment up until the 1970s. Now, in your USA course, which you'll study later on, we'll look at the Vietnam War in depth, but it's the Vietnam War which really challenges that idea of containment. So throughout the 1970s, containment is less of a concern, and then it will come back with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Now, along with the Truman Doctrine, there is the Marshall Plan, sometimes called Marshall Aid. Marshall was an ally of President Truman. He was his Secretary of State, what we would call his foreign minister or his foreign secretary. So Truman Doctrine focuses much more on the military side of it, the political, the power side of it, whereas Marshall Plan or Marshall Aid is the economic side, the money side. Marshall was worried that especially Western Europe had been devastated by World War II. Their economies were in shambles. They didn't have the ability to get themselves back up and running. And that's the sort of situation where communism could thrive. So, in other words, if you can support a democratic and capitalist country, if you can show the people of that country that capitalism can be successful, they're not going to want to be communist. To add to Marshall's fears, while these discussions were happening, Czechoslovakia is turned communist by its own people. So a very brief civil war happens, or a coup d'etat. People like Jan Masaryk are killed, and the government becomes solidly communist. Now, in terms of the events of Marshall Plan or Marshall Aid, they're sending machinery, they're sending specialists, they're sending equipment, and they are sending billions of dollars to all of the countries you can see on this map. The blue bar gives you a very rough idea of how much money is being sent to each country. So you can see that Britain in particular is getting the lion's share of this, followed by France, and then West Germany and Italy. Now, Stalin bans any Eastern European country that he already influences or controls from accepting America's money. Instead, he'll come up with the Comecon, which we'll come over in a couple of minutes' time. Now, the precise detail here is really, really important. It's the kind of thing that you should try and show off to the examiner with. By 1953, so just 5 years later, 16 countries had been sent a total of $17 billion. Now, at the time, $17 billion was a ridiculous amount of money. Loads of Americans hadn't wanted to spend that much money. So Truman had an uphill battle and Marshall had an uphill battle to convince the US Congress to send that much. But from his point of view, loads of money spent now would save even more money in the future, because if all of Europe turned communist, that would lead to a World War III, which America might lose. Now, the results of the Marshall Plan are incredibly similar to the results of the Truman Doctrine. America was accused of bribing the West, which they kind of are, to be honest, showing the value of capitalism by bribing them with the fruits of capitalism. Stalin was growing nervous that the capitalist West would grow richer and more powerful, and in particular, West Germany. Remember, one of Stalin's main fears is that a German country, strong and able to keep on fighting, might invade the Soviet Union, might invade Russia for the third time in a century. Germany invaded Russia in World War I, they invaded Russia in World War II. That's why he had been so sure to try and cripple East Germany. So now we're going to look at what the Soviets' responses were to the Truman Doctrine and then the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan. So the Cominform is set up in the same year as the Truman Doctrine. The causes of it are basically the results of the Truman Doctrine. Stalin was worried, so he set this organization up. It's called the Communist Information Bureau, but I'm never going to use that. We're just going to call it the Cominform. The point of the Cominform is to coordinate or match up all of the communist countries and even communist parties in non-communist countries. So the communist parties of Britain and France were told to follow the instructions of the Soviet Union Cominform. All communist countries, therefore, were to have a shared foreign policy. What that would mean in practice is that if the Soviet Union didn't want, let's say, Poland to have relations with France, Poland would be blocked from having relations with France. Or if the Soviet Union didn't want Hungary to set up a trade deal with Italy, Hungary would not set up a trade deal with Italy. They also wanted them to collectivize their farming, in other words, join smaller farms together and speed up the industrialization of their cities. Both of these would move them towards a more communist state or a more communist economy. And finally, all communist countries were to somehow purge people who refused to follow Moscow's orders. That does not necessarily just mean capitalists and democrats. It could also be communists who didn't approve of the Soviet Union controlling other countries. So you might be able to think of what the results of the Cominform were, because they're going to be the reverse of the results for the Truman Doctrine. America viewed this as Stalin spreading his dictatorship, which he obviously was. This was only really stopped by Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1956. So it's relatively short-lived compared to something like NATO or the Warsaw Pact, which we'll look at in future lessons. But certainly for the next decade, there are fears that the Cominform might help start a Third World War. Having a look at the causes and events of the Comecon. Now, this is set up a year after Marshall Plan, because it takes a while to organise all of this. The causes, again, sees the Marshall Plan as an attempt to bribe Europe. So Stalin wants to try and set up his own scheme, which will show Eastern Europe that communism is economically better. So Comecon is a nickname. It really means the Council for Mutual Assistance, but again, I'm never going to use that. So you should just remember Cominform and Comecon. Marshall Aid, or Marshall Plan, is essentially a massive bribe. Billions of dollars of equipment, factories, experts, supplies. The Comecon is slightly different. They'll set up trade deals with the Soviet Union and other countries. But more importantly, they tell those countries what to focus on, what to produce. So Bulgaria, for example, because it's got plenty of agricultural lands, they were made to focus on food. Whereas East Germany, although they did have agriculture, were told to focus on heavy industry. In other words, the making of metals for equipment and things like that. The result of this is that communist countries in Eastern Europe are incredibly dependent on the USSR. In other words, they're not self-sufficient. They can't look after themselves because their own economy relies on other economies, and all of those economies are dependent on the Soviet Union. And again, the result of this is that the USA see this as Stalin expanding his dictatorship, which again, it definitely is. We're not saying that America was innocent in this, but certainly the American examples of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, they're not specifically saying to those Western countries, you must do whatever we say. All they say is you must not turn communist. Now, I've got a couple of stretch and challenges for you to be thinking about here. Now, if you think about these tit-for-tat measures, in other words, the Truman Doctrine is passed and then the Cominform is passed. The Marshall Plan is passed, so the Comecon is passed. To what extent are these sorts of measures somehow worse than direct conflict between America and the Soviet Union? Also start to think about whether or not any of these arguments or disagreements could have been prevented by different outcomes at the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. I know we keep coming back to these two wartime conferences, but they really do set the stage for the Cold War, and it's very possible you could get an exam question asking about why they were important for the beginning of the Cold War. So now we're going to look at the first example of exam practice. Remember I said these questions are completely unique in the GCSE course. They don't come up on any of your other 3 papers. So the first one we're going to look at is the question 1. Explain 2 consequences of ... So the question will always start in that way. You get 2 P paragraphs to write, and each P paragraph is marked separately. So it's 4 marks for each consequence or each result. The question we're going to look at is explain 2 consequences of the Truman Doctrine, 1947. So can you please pause the video again and think, what on earth can you talk about for two consequences? Now we've got a couple of suggestions in the box here. So we've got 4 different bullet points, but it's not the case that you'd only have to write about one in each consequence. If you're trying to go for full marks, you need to try and add as much precise factual detail as possible to make sure that you are showing the examiner you really do know your stuff. So if you are going for 7 or 8 marks out of 8, I would suggest combining A and B and then combining C and D. So the basic structure is going to be a key paragraph that you've been practicing for years now. So one consequence of the Truman Doctrine, using the phrasing of the question. Got an example of a starter sentence for your evidence. And obviously we're using several sentences here. It's not just a 3-sentence paragraph. The more details you include, the better. And then the final sentence needs to directly link back to the question. It's always good practice to try and use the phrasing of the question if you're not quite sure how to answer it correctly. Now we've got an example of a previous student's answer that I've typed up here. So let's have a quick read through this. One consequence of the Truman Doctrine was that countries in Europe were able to stop becoming communist. Truman promised Europe and the wider world to help to contain the spread of communism. This was very important for countries like Greece, which were fighting a civil war, as Britain was warning that they were unable to help much longer. The USA sent supplies to the Greeks, helping to end the war. As a result, Truman was able to keep his promise of the Truman Doctrine, as no other European countries became communist after 1948. Now, as an examiner, I would certainly give that 3 marks out of 4. I would probably pick them up on the final mark because the blue section, the evidence, is kind of a bit wordy without giving too much precise factual detail. So they could definitely get that 4th mark by adding some more precise factual detail. They could add, for example, the information about Marshall Plan. They could go on to be talking about Greece, or even just the idea that they're in a civil war and Britain is supporting the royalist governments or things like that. So we are expecting to see an example answer from every single one of you guys. If you want to use this paragraph as a basis, that is absolutely fine, but I'd definitely recommend maybe using it as inspiration, but writing it out yourself, and obviously coming up with a second paragraph of your own. So that's everything we've got on the Truman Doctrine and how he deepened the Cold War. We'll see you guys next lesson.